We're really grateful that you are here with us, even though you're in quarantine. Hope you're feeling okay. Hope the voice is okay.
Voice is a lot better. Just the energy level and some of this brain fog that people talk about is a real thing.
I know. All right. Well, thanks for joining us, Kali. Let's get started, okay? Welcome everyone to Utopia 213, and I'm really delighted and thrilled to welcome Kali Akuno. Kali Akuno is the co-founder and co-director of Cooperation Jackson. He's been a lifelong organizer, philosopher, practitioner, and builder of what I consider to be concrete utopias. He's been involved in many human rights and social justice issues and struggles and solidarity economy projects. He served as the co-director of the U.S. Human Rights Network, the executive director of the People's Hurricane Relief Fund based in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. He served as the director of special projects and external funding in the mayoral administration of the late Chokwe Lumumba of Jackson, Mississippi, where he was supporting cooperative development, the introduction of eco-friendly and carbon reduction methods of operation, promotion of human rights and international relations for the city. He's also co-founded the School of Social Justice and Community Development, which is a public school serving the academic needs of low-income African-American and Latino communities in Oakland, California. So it's really great to have you with us, Kali. You have dedicated your life to the issues and to the questions that we are examining and trying to practice ourselves. Now, I'm sure you're wondering what you're doing in a public seminar that's called Utopia 1313 when the world around us is so dystopic today.
Not
only
really.
With the
I'm glad somebody's addressing the question.
Exactly. With the water crisis in Jackson, Mississippi, and the global climate warming that actually caused the river flooding along the Pearl River watershed, and the infrastructure failures there, with the local and global crises all around us, why utopia? And, it's more than just, what we're trying to do is more than just dream, more than just think about hopeful futures. We're trying to find concrete utopias in order to create a kind of dialectical, forward-moving motion, building on concrete utopias that exist today, and then thinking about using them to energize us to think about future utopias as well, or better futures. And so it's this back and forth, but I think that the concrete utopias give us an assurance that we can achieve just outcomes because we can see some ourselves. And so that gives us something to build on. And I view Cooperation Jackson as a perfect illustration of what I consider to be a concrete utopia and a concrete utopian vision in all of its dimensions, in terms of the long history that it builds on, in terms of the theory that you, Kali Akuno, you've been so extraordinary at developing, particularly in this book that we've all read, Jackson Rising, that you edited and that you wrote so many chapters in here. That was an outgrowth of the conference, Jackson Rising, that you helped organize back in 2017, I think it was.
2014,
yeah. So along the lines of history, of theory, and of praxis, as I tried to spell out in the introduction that's on the blog, I really view Cooperation Jackson as just a remarkable project. And we're going to talk about the water crisis in Jackson, and we're going to talk about the global warming and its effects. But I want to start really with some of the theory and some of the history of Cooperation Jackson, and actually with the history, because it feels as if the space that you're trying to develop that you are developing this project, the space that you have claimed where you are is so rich with history, going back to the 1970s and the development of the community, the El Haj Malik community, going forward to the Jackson-Kush plan in 2008, and then, of course, cooperation 2014. So maybe we could start, maybe you could give us a sense of kind of the historical dimension of Cooperation Jackson. Let me just ask everybody to mute whoever's on, everybody, that we got a bunch of folks on Zoom, make sure you mute your audio so that we don't hear you chit-chatting. Let me turn it to you, Kali, to give us a little bit of the historical context in which these many projects that you've been involved with, the many ones, I mean, not just Cooperation Jackson, obviously, but the Kush Jackson project as well. Some of that history, because I think it's so important to thinking about the future.
Well, but no problem. Again, pleasure to be with all of you. Disappointed I couldn't be there in person. I think these things are always better in person. But despite what Biden and many others are saying, the pandemic is still with us. I think it's become endemic to our species now. So it's just something that, like the flu, it's going to be with us. But I'm happy I'm able to, be strong enough, at least for the moment, to be able to talk to everybody and try to share a little bit of my experience and collective experience, that I have been a part and both a product of. So let me, I guess, into the question, let me focus in very specifically to Jackson first, to just kind of set some terms and context. So, Jackson, unfortunately, is a shrinking city. At its height, it was about 400,000 people, and this was in the 1960s. And it has been kind of shrinking since. It held steady until like I would say the early 1990s, have been declining since, but it didn't become a majority Black city until the 1980s. And that's critical to note for where we are now, particularly around like the water, infrastructure, et cetera. And what's critical to note about that is that, Jackson made the shift, the 20th century shift, to become a majority Black city late in the process, when many other cities had become that, by the middle of the 20th century. So a place like Detroit or Baltimore or Cleveland or Oakland, California, where I am now, those cities kind of made their transition after the great migrations, from the Deep South to fill all of the industrial jobs that had been developing since the turn of the century, but that really got accelerated after World War II. And, the great expansion that happened in the midst of the Great Depression, but accelerated in the course of the war, and then took another leap forward after the industrial kind of heartlands of Europe in particular have been devastated. So Jackson, you got to put in this kind of context, like, why did it become majority Black so late, particularly when earlier in the 20th century, for those of you who don't know, Mississippi was one of two states that had a Black majority in its history. And Mississippi had a Black majority statewide in the earlier part of the 20th century, and then that flipped by I think the 1960s. So why, if it had a Black majority, did Jackson, the capital city, become Black so late? Well, number one, even though it is one of two major kind of industrial heartland areas in the state of Mississippi. The other one being around the Gulfport area, where the U.S. military has been building massive warships, and there's another shipping building industry that's down at the southern portion of Mississippi. Mississippi, Jackson fundamentally has served as a transport hub within the overall kind of commerce, transport, economic life of the United States. It was first built around, the railroads and having some access, relatively easy access to two rivers, the Pearl River, which the city of Jackson is built basically on, and the Mississippi River, which is roughly about 45 miles to our west. But it wasn't until, the Great Migration North really started to dry up in places like St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit, Akron, Cleveland, couldn't absorb the waves of, Black migrants who were there seeking jobs as America's kind of industrial capacity started to level out with Europe regrouping, and then particularly Japan and other parts of Southeast Asia under U.S. tutelage, mind you, but as they started to ramp up their industrial capacity. Japan, for those of you who may be too, young, Japan was kind of the boogeyman of the 70s and 80s. And you would see all the same kind of articles about, Japan is going to outstrip the United States, blah, 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 blah. It played that role in kind of the global capitalist infrastructure at that particular point in time. And so, it wasn't until those areas really couldn't absorb any further folks that the last kind of migrants of folks, particularly who were in the Delta, started migrating down into Jackson. And that precipitated white flight and capital flight. Those two go hand in hand for most of the capital's history, not so much anymore, but for most of capital's history, that's the way those two have gone. And in Jackson, that played out severely. So its turnover into a majority Black city was quick, was real quick. And the New African Independence Movement, when you mention, the El Malik community, that was, for those of you who don't know, and it was mentioned in the book, but not fully, I think, articulated. There was an effort by the provisional governor of the Republic of New Africa, which officially started in Detroit in 1968. And during its second major election period, 1970, there was a sharp kind of change in direction under the new president's kind of leadership to establish an independent capital in Mississippi and in the El Malik community, which was supposed to be about 20 miles to the west of Jackson proper. But the staging area where folks were, being asked to come find and build community was in Jackson, Mississippi, and particularly in the West Jackson community in Mississippi. And that wasn't by chance, that wasn't by accident. The short story of it is that a core component of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was based in that neighborhood. And SNCC went through a period of about a 4-year period of transformation in its politics, with a significant section of it becoming what we would call revolutionary nationalists. That's the group that wind up, articulating the paper that wind up giving rise to the slogan and the movement of Black Power, right? Which was announced in Mississippi, a little further up in Greenwood, on the March Against Fear in 1966. So that march wind up coming in and settling in the neighborhood that we are situated in. And there's been a historic base of, several families, which I would say have been the root in that community, that really have been the anchors, of this particular politics, both in terms of their organizing for it, but laying a material foundation, making their homes available, making land available, and then people coming in very intentionally and deliberately from 1970 on to kind of expand around that. Folks who were coming in, young Black people like Chokwe Lumumba came down during that period from Detroit, and started to establish community there. And I'm one of basically the children and of that period. I was born in 1972, and grew up in the midst of all of this, developing. I kind of say I was born at kind of a high point. I saw it, kind of dip down as the movement waned in the 1980s in particular, but learned all those lessons. Absorbed as much of the theory as I possibly could, as well as others, and then tried to find ways. I think most of my adult life has been trying to find ways within our particular space, time, and conditions to realize the aims and objectives of that movement, which is, Black self-determination and overall social liberation for everybody in the society. So, that's some of the context, and Cooperation Jackson and the Jackson-Kush plan is really just, I wouldn't say it's a reiteration of many of the things that have been laid out before, but it's based upon those foundations. It's based upon that theory and practice. And it just was based upon an analysis from the mid-2000s about how we could actually move, sorry about that.
No worries.
How we could actually move the community in such a way that we could attain some electoral power as an expression of political power, and to be able to put core parts of our program, the co-ops, the people's assemblies, directly into practice, to be able to extend both economic and material kind of influence in the community, and then the long-term objective is a cultural shift. And so, we thought we were in position to do that, and I think as a result of our organizing and the diligence and both the amount of work we put in and the quality of the work that we put in, I think our projects have borne some fruits. We haven't accomplished everything we wanted to accomplish by far, but pretty significant, I think, experiment in the context of social movement history in the United States.
Yeah, no, I agree. And thanks for that history, because you can feel the kind of different the important different pieces of the historical trajectories kind of that bring us to the present. I mean, this notion of kind of, in part, the story that you tell about, white flight and capital flight is so central to the infrastructure problems that you're having now. But at the same time, the majority Black historical trajectory is also so important to Black self-determination, right? In specifically where you are in West Jackson. So the ways in which kind of the history and the historical trajectories kind of lead in different directions as both a source of power and as a source of problems in terms of like the infrastructure problems and the non-investment in the area. So that's really helpful. And also, the different ways in which these historical periods overlap are interesting, right? Because I mean, the early El Malik project from the 1970s really did feel like a classic utopia in a way, almost. Buying land and trying to create and moving people there, trying to create a self-determining community. That has a lot of aspects of what we used to conventionally think about as a utopian society, right? It was the idea of a certain form of separatism, but on its own land, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that becomes a piece of Cooperation Jackson too, which is the land trust that you all have put in place, right? So, but in a slightly different, there's a slightly different character to it in a way, or a feeling, at least from the outside, in terms of like the community land trust, which is so important. But let's talk a little bit about the theoretical underpinnings in relationship to that history, right? So there was a project in the 1970s to actually buy land and start a community. There's some similarities with Cooperation Jackson, right?
Mm-hmm,
there?
Mm-hmm. Oh, there's some profound similarities. I would say the main distinction and difference is that, folks owning property together is not new. There's different ways in which there's been joint holdings of land. But the main difference was, that was largely private. The effort and the thinking was largely privately owned, right, or organizationally owned.
Okay.
The big difference is that the tool, if you want to call it that, of community land trust was just being innovated, really, right? And for folks who are not, that familiar, the form of community land trust we have now is a direct outcome of the civil rights and the Black Power movement, right? The first major community land trust emerged, again, out of a SNCC kind of led effort in Georgia, right? And that was started in 1967. Mm-hmm. So this form just wasn't that familiar yet to people, right? But they had the objective of holding something in mind. Well, here we are, some 50 years later, we can now benefit and have, I would say, benefited from being able to have kind of collective and a form of communal property, a form of commons in the community land trust, which preserves it for the community in like democratic control, but is not subject to individual kind of ownership, which our movements have had some problems with, in the past.
Right.
So, same objective, but we just know about this tool. We know about its history. We know about some of its strengths and some of its weaknesses from, that 50-year period of difference that we can incorporate into our practice, and we have.
Right. So let's actually focus on this for just a moment so that everybody understands how the community land trust works, because I'm sure not everybody is as familiar and could use some background on it, because I think it is particularly interesting, and it's only one piece of Cooperation Jackson. So we'll come to other pieces of Cooperation Jackson, like the cooperatives and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But on the community land trust, so back in the I take it that originally with the El Malik project in 1970 and 71, that was property that was owned, that was owned in private but used collectively in a way, right? Which is a different model, I take it is what you're suggesting, to the community land trust. How does the community land trust work exactly? And how does it differ from earlier forms of communal attempts at communal ownership? Yeah.
Well, I mean, how that community was initially set up. There was the Black family who owned a significant number of acres, right, in the community that they wanted to build in, who were willing to sell a significant portion of that. And the quickest way to do it was to sell it to another individual within the provisional government, which they did. And then it was up to that individual, which also happened, but it was up to that individual to transfer the ownership to the actual provisional government. Now, when in the process of the political struggle that happened, that transfer never happened, right? It was blocked.
Okay.
Right. And then the federal government did, the FBI in particular, really worked on that family with a lot of applied pressure, a lot of having the IRS look at taxes and purchases for them to eventually rescind moving on selling the larger part of it. So it all kind of collapsed and fell apart. But the way it was supposed to go down, that land was supposed to be held by the provisional government, right? So, and the theory at the time by the president, Mario Badele, who I would say was one of the chief theoreticians around the new African independence, but probably the most preeminent theoretician of the movement. He was looking to make that public land, right? In the sense that it would be held by this government in exile, right? And then be used as a point of contention and challenge on the world stage through international appeals for recognition, right, of the provisional government, for legal status, for protection, for resources, diplomatic cover. I mean, the folks went so far as, in many cases, trying to employ some laws from drawn throughout the colonial world, where passports and things were issued, different status papers were issued, and then also looking at some of the Native American treaties and conventions where some points there might be relevant, where, like, for instance, folks don't know, the Iroquois Confederacy still to this day, they have their own passports, they have some of their own identification that they can travel with and actually use, I think in limited ways, but they can travel and use internationally, right? Wow. So it was trying to draw upon that. And the big difference is here, we're not operating under the pretext of having, or at least operating under the pretext of an entity which is challenging the direct sovereignty at this point of the United States government. And so it's a way to hold land in common at this stage, kind of like of the struggle, and to do so in a way that, since ours is owned by a nonprofit, right? The Cooperation Jackson, so you all know, has different kind of wings to it, and that's constantly growing and expanding. So like our educational and training work, that falls almost exclusively within the realm of our nonprofit. But then like the federation part, of which the co-ops operate and kind of pay into and share resources through, that is a LLC that has an internal cooperative operating agreement. And that's important. We get into all this legalese, but it's important for folks to understand that in Mississippi, only allows by statute 3 forms of cooperatives. They can be farming related, right? Agricultural production related. They can be utility related. So a good number of our utilities, at least on paper, are co-ops in Mississippi and throughout most of the South. And then the third one is credit unions. And they limit it in this way very much so on the basis of collective anything. This was adopted in the 1930s. So a collective anything being a way towards or some practice towards socialism or communism. So that bias has been built into the law, and it's still a political bias that exists to this day. We've done some lobbying work to change that law, and they still are using and upholding that rhetoric even now.
That's fascinating. So the cooperatives are actually LLCs. They're incorporated as LSCs because there isn't a cooperative law available to incorporate them as a cooperative, basically.
That's right. With the exception of one. Freedom Farms is a co-op, a registered co-op.
Oh, but that's because it's agricultural.
That's because it's agriculture, right? With the exception of one. But the rest of them, yes. So our option and choice were, and this was a political choice, right? Our choices were operating as an LLC or register out of state, which some co-ops do. Register out of state, and then just ask for a business license to operate within Mississippi. That way you can be an official co-op in Wisconsin or New York or Vermont or whatever places that all three of those states where there's co-ops in the state, which are that we know of, that we work with, that are technically registered there and just have operating licenses in the state of Mississippi. Now, we chose not to do that. So everybody's clear. We chose not to go that second route because we wanted to make a point about actually paying taxes to the state that we live in, right? In the state that we work in and that we produce in, to make an argument about the need for public goods, right? And that taxes are a way of supporting and supplying revenue to the public good, which gets us back to our current crisis. Why are we in this boat? Because there is no public good, there is no tax base, and there's been no tax allocation for resource to the infrastructure that we had. So we were making this argument, and it's still our argument. So one of the things that some people think that we're foolish for instance, is we have a nonprofit, pretty significant size nonprofit for Mississippi these days. And people are like, you guys pay taxes on property? Like, yes, because we want our community, we want services in our community. We need a public entity, right? That folks can draw upon as a common resource. So that's just so folks are clear why we are making some of these choices from the beginning that we made, understand, given our read of what the state needs and what the community needs.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this conversation, I think, is in a really interesting way, kind of blending in the history into the theory and the praxis of Cooperation Jackson, which is so evidently this kind of multi-dimensional, from a legal perspective, it's really a multi-dimensional entity, right? With including, so the agricultural cooperative that is Freedom Farms, right? And then I take it that Nubia Place Cafe and the Green Team are both LLCs that operate functionally as cooperatives, right? And then there's the land trust, and then the nonprofits. And are there other kind of legal pieces to the total entity? Like there's the Human Rights Institute. There's like the Human Rights Institute too.
We got too many kind of threads out there. I mean, and there's a effort and a division to initiative, I should say, to form a 501c4, right? Which would allow us to do a certain kind of like lobbying, and to have more political speech. And it's the latter that we are interested in, right? To be able to engage in more political speech that doesn't then penalize the nonprofit for some of the stances and positions it wants to take.
Right. The LLCs can have political speech, can't they?
Yes. Yeah. But see, but our LLC is only a how would you call it? It's like a holding company,
Okay.
right? It's a place where all the co-ops pay yearly dues, and the way we are structured, the nonprofit provides training, technical expertise, and some capital infrastructure outlays to all of the co-ops, right? Interest free. But the way that they are structured is that at least the portion of like the equipment and capital, those things, each of the co-ops pay back, right? On like basically a no interest loan. But the payback doesn't necessarily, part of it goes back into the nonprofit, but the majority of that just goes back into that LLC to then be redistributed for the next generation of cooperatives to be developed and trained, right? And so we've been doing that, fairly successful, but it only exists for them to make like those collective decisions. So it is not producing things of its own. Each co-op is its own LLC, and it has its own board. They have their own boards. They have their own operating norms and procedures and bylaws, etc. So they have their own kind of independent life and operation, like outside of that. And so their speech can be profoundly, if they wanted to be, can be profoundly different than what Cooperation Jackson's political speech is. So that's a piece around each entity's own, degrees of autonomy, basically.
Right. Now, how does so all of these different pieces that are kind of that have historical roots and that are kind of really interesting. I mean, historically path dependent and legally path dependent as well. But all of the different pieces form Cooperation Jackson. Now, how does which I take it, of course, by its very name and by all of the things you do about participatory democratic decision making. So how does that function at a kind of at the level of putting together all of these different pieces and voices participating in where to go next or what to develop more than something, et cetera, et cetera. How does the participatory democratic aspect of the big picture work?
A lot of creative tension, to put it mildly. Where there's the least kind of flexibility, and it may seem contradictory, but where there's the least flexibility is actually in the nonprofit space, right? Because that is where, in taking private donations or, any kind of donations there, the board and the executive director, i.e. myself, if we say we're going to, like right now, we've been taking a good number of donations in for like the water crisis. Right. Well, I'm limited to every penny that came in from that point forward has to go towards something that is specifically designated as water crisis, unless I have the permission of the donor, to say I can spend this on general operating funds, then it has to be earmarked for that, right? And this is a piece that we've really kind of have to stress to a lot of people who've come behind us, kind of inquiring about our model and want to follow some things. And we have to say, like, you have to know when and where democracy actually can be applied within the structure that you want to create, and be very clear about the structures you want to create. I don't like we've taken some hard knock lessons from oh, we can do that, but then the IRS says no, you can't, or the state auditors come and say no, you can't do this. You couldn't spend doing money on that. We're going to penalize you here or there. And you learn and you grow and be like, okay, well, the the problem was I didn't do it through the correct vehicle. Not that I can't do it. And so it's us was trying to learn and figure out, well, what is the right vehicle to make this decision within, right? And if we collectively agree, we want to do X, Y, and Z. Is that through the LLC? Is that through the nonprofit? And that's why we've come to this other piece, right? Like, well, we're at a point now in our growth and maturity. We probably need this C4, right, to be able to tackle and do some things that gives us more leverage. Like so for instance, to make it clear to the audience, like there's a serious campaign we need to mount against Governor Phil Bryant about this water crisis and his particular role over the last decade, even before he was the governor, while he was lieutenant governor, that he did to block Jackson having access, to bond funds and to other funds to be able to the system to make, these little repairs, but he just choked the city of any resources. So we need to really go at him. It would be easier. There's several different ways that he can retaliate, and he's going to do it anyway. Even when we set this up, he's going to do it anyway. But it would be harder for him to retaliate against a C4 than it would against the C3, right? In terms of certain protections. So that's where we're like, okay, we need to find the vehicle that is best necessary within the kind of conditions that will give us the leverage and the power and the flexibility that we need. So for us, we are saying the general, like democracy, participatory democracy is the broad principle. But we understand within the legal structures that we're trying to operate, the legal structures that exist and the democracy we're striving for, they are at profound odds with each other. Profound.
Yeah.
But that should be a barrier. That's my point. Shouldn't be a barrier to practicing it. We just have to find the creative ways to practice that gives everybody who wants to be involved the protection that they need.
Yeah. I mean, one thing it makes me think is, boy, you need some good lawyers too. And like, we're right here. I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, this is Columbia Law School right here, right? We've got a bunch of good lawyers right around me. And we should start up a project here that is like, you probably got your own great lawyers, but maybe we could be, the legal counsel here, right? You know what I mean? Got a lot of pro bono good attorneys right in this room. That I was just thinking that. But the other thing I was thinking was, the People's Assembly model. Now that was really a big piece of the Kush-Jackson plan, I think, was the People's Assembly as a way of getting everyone's voice in and having participatory democracy. Really, you write beautifully about it in your book, Jackson Rising, in the chapter People's Assembly Overview, right, where you talk about people's assemblies as allowing people to exercise their agency, exert their power, practice democracy, meaning the rule of the people, for the people, by the people. By the way, this is on page 87. In its broadest terms, entails making direct decisions about economic, social, and cultural operations of a community or society. And I know that was a part of the Kush-Jackson plan. Have you been able to bring that into Cooperation Jackson, or is an aspect? Go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So there's the organizations, excuse me, kind of general assembly, and then there are the People's Assembly that we do just in the community.
Okay.
And those have been challenging to do under the conditions of COVID-19.
Okay. Right.
Done several over the last 3 years. We did 4 in 2020.
Were they online?
No. We did the first one in July, and we did 4 in a row. And then we had our first collective outbreak of, a minor barbecue at the end of one of our People's Assembly turned into a super spreader event.
Okay.
And so that shut that down for 2020, basically. Then we did 2. We planned for 6 in 2021, but we only did 2. Again, just the way COVID was moving in our community. And we've held 3 this year, 1 which was virtual. And we've given that a shot. We didn't like it. Not that the medium itself is bad of doing something virtually. So don't get me wrong there. What we knew going in, and we tried to plan for what we're not able to overcome, and we don't think we have the resources to overcome this right now. But the main thing was it wind up like there was nobody over 50 on the virtual.
Nobody over 50?
There was nobody over 50 on the virtual.
Okay, right, okay.
And
right.
And the reason being, there was most folks in our community don't have either access to cell phones with the capability or computers. Right. They don't have it. That is the digital divide in my community is real. It is very, very real and very deep and persistent. The school district has been trying to overcome it. I think they did some significant work because they had to during the pandemic, but so access amongst youth in the community has definitely gone up as a result of the pandemic and the public resources they got to utilize. But folks over 50 still are, it's like a whole different country. Right. Like they just won't engage much unless people are already into it. So yeah, we was with when as
if you were born in 72, that you're gonna hit the digital divide in a moment right there.
Right. I literally it's already hit me in certain ways. Like there's certain I have a big ongoing war with the staff who want to digitize everything. And each week I find myself becoming more and more, what's the word I'm looking for?
I call it Luddite.
Huh?
I call it Luddite. But.
Yeah, Luddite. I literally am becoming more and more of a Luddite every week. There's, I just don't, I'm getting to the point now where like, no, I'm not creating a new password for every program. Why do I have to have another profile for this? I already have 10, like there's too much. So I'm just, I feel folks, when I was on that call, this was like 2 months ago, and I immediately within like 5 minutes recognized I was the oldest person on the call. So I was like, yeah, this is not representative of our community and the people's assemblies. But it's been a struggle. I mean, for the reasons that we have, they definitely have not been as representative as they were before, the pandemic in terms of how many people come out and what sectors of the community are coming out. Since the pandemic, they've definitely tended more to the young side, and that's not we want that. That's not like a bad thing. But the thing that folks don't understand is, Jackson has kind of an inverted bell curve. This is why this is important in our community. So we have a problem in our community, similar to like the global South or the third world. Most of the working age adults are not here. Folks from, the ages of 20 to like 50, the vast majority of them leave the city of Jackson. It's a major drain on us, has been for generations now. But, and particularly amongst folks who have like are college educated, they don't typically tend to stay in Jackson.
Right.
And,
which contributes to the whole, the whole historical trajectory that we were talking about, and creating this moment, really, right? That's another piece of it, really.
Right.
Now, let me ask you, so in your theorizing about Cooperation Jackson, you talk a lot about transforming Jackson as a city into, a sustainability city, a solidarity city, a fabrication city, and a human rights city. Is that still part of the, I mean, in other words, kind of like the idea of transforming Jackson as a whole, as a city, is that still part of the project, or how does in other words, like, how does the ambition of creating Cooperation Jackson, which itself is a huge ambition, relate to the ambition to change Jackson as a city itself, right? I mean, there was some separatism originally in the older ideas in the 1970s. I take it that's no longer a form of separatism, or is it an ambition of thinking about the city as a whole or the region as a whole? Sorry, you get the idea.
No, I mean, if you talk about ambition, it's part of it is just starting where we are, but believing that we can have an impact through forming solid relationships. First with other like-minded people that we can and we need to have a global impact, right? Like U.S. can make some major strides, for instance, using, some language of trying to be a climate leader. And if it went, just reduce its emissions by half, I mean, that would be reduced emissions almost like by 1/4 on a global scale. But that's a problem that's going to have to be worked out on a global level. Like we have to play our part, but we got to convince and work with other people and create new relationships, productive relationships, political relationships, social relationships, which make doing business and operating, like in carbon neutral ways, quote unquote, a beneficial norm. And so, our to understand us, this is like, look, I can theorize about the broader world all I want, and that's not an unhealthy exercise, right? I'm a leftist who believes that, our lack of dreaming for the last, couple of decades has probably been our greatest weakness. So, we should dream, and we should dream big. But the reality is you got to put your foot down someplace and actually start to try to practice and make real what you're dreaming of, right? If only to just be an example. And I hope we are, of like, hey, we can say like there's some things we've done remarkably well on, and there's some things we got a lot of areas to improve upon. But either way, you got something that I think that you can learn from us, right? People can learn from it either way, the good or the bad, or the indifferent, right? But it's like we now have 10 years of accumulated practice, that can be assessed, that can be examined, right? Can be questioned. And that's a good thing. So we like, put your foot down, let's do this. But, because we are trying to be involved with the global systems that we're locked in, we're not thinking that just doing well in Jackson is going to be enough, right? Like, it's not. Like, we don't, we're still bound by having to deal with all the external factors and forces around pricing. Like, we don't determine the price of certain goods and services. We have to negotiate ourselves with the market still at this stage in our development for certain things to happen and to move. So we're kind of interlocked with that. But then the question becomes that we pose ourselves, okay, well, what is our relationship with these products, and what are our relationships with the products and services, like the people on the other end who are producing that? How can we be in solidarity with the workers who are delivering on these different things by being in some form of direct relationship that we can then subject to a democratic process, right? That's what we're trying to get after. And that is where we think we can build stronger in the long term, stronger real relationships that are about a broader transformation in the community, and then in the world at large.
Right. Yeah, and actually that raises the connection with Cooperation Vermont, right? In part, so Cooperation Jackson. When you had the Jackson Rising Conference, you really made a call for others to start other cooperations, and there's Cooperation Humboldt in California, and there's Cooperation Vermont. But what's interesting is the way in which now you're collaborating with Cooperation Jackson. If I understand correctly, you were the actual legal vehicle for them to purchase and turn the Marshfield General Store into a cooperative.
That's right. It's in the process of becoming a cooperative, right?
Okay.
It's not fully there yet. We bought the Cooperation Jackson, so folks understand. Cooperation Jackson is the owner of the building that the Marshfield Village store operates within, right? Okay. So it is part of our community land trust.
Okay.
The business itself, the Marshfield Village store, is its own complete entity. Again, that kind of division. We do some training and counseling with them. I sit on the board of the Marshfield Village co-op as it's developing, and Cooperation Vermont. One I've been asked to serve for a 2-year period, and the other one I told them I can only do one. And that's the Cooperation Vermont, because like you need more local people. Right now it's like 50% out of state folks and 50% in-state. And I learn from our experience. We've done that. We've got some criticism from that. Go more local, like at this stage in your development, and we'll help you just get a ground on like the legal paperwork, processes and procedures, good practices, doing that. And then, but what the intent is cooperation, and what the agreement is, Cooperation Jackson is going to then donate that building to Cooperation Vermont, so that Cooperation Vermont has that as a resource, right? And there's no transfer of money or anything like that goes down to just one community kind of piece to another. We're also doing the same thing in New Orleans, right? That there's a building which used to be the New Day Collective Fight Back Center. We purchased that in 2019 with members of that community there. Same thing like with the community members that we know in Marshfield. The big difference is in New Orleans, we are in the middle of a serious gentrification struggle. And it's just been tied up in a bunch of red tape with the city. So much so that we wanted to save the original building that was there for historic reasons.
Yep, I hear you.
Sorry about that. For historic reasons.
Yep.
But the city of New Orleans basically was going to charge us, was going to renovate the building would actually have been twice as expensive as just tearing it down and starting over. So we tore it down this January, and we're in the process now of getting all the permits and approvals to build a new facility, which we're, knock on wood, cross your fingers, toes, whatever you can do to help us out. We hope we can do for about $400,000 to build a new 3-story space over on St. Bernard Avenue. So, and it's the same type of dynamic, that will be turned over and just donated to New Day. That, partner and collaboration. Where we are all working together is through a new entity called the People's Network for Land and Liberation, right?
For land what?
And building those relationships. You're on mute.
Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me? I know I'm on mute.
All right, you're on mute.
I know I'm on mute, but that's because it should be going through the mic. Can you hear me though?
You're still on mute, Bernard.
Okay. Hold on. Sorry, hold on. We're gonna fix that.
Is this mic working for you?
Okay, that one's where I can hear you now. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, great. Thanks. So I did want to ask. I do want to open this up to everyone else. We've got a bunch of people here. We've got a bunch of people on Zoom as well, and I know that they have questions. And I also don't want to tax you too much. I know you're in quarantine, and I really thank you so much for, despite the coughs and the fatigue for joining us. So I'm going to open it up in a minute, and if anybody on Zoom has questions, you should just put something in the chat that you want to turn on your video and ask the questions, okay? But one thing is about the model of the relationship. It was interesting you were saying that you want these other projects to be local based. So in a way, the vision here seems to be of you helping to plant this, helping to support local cooperative developments in these other localities, but not necessarily create a multi-state cooperation entity. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. I mean, there's more nuance to it, but that's right.
Okay, all right, that's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. And the last thing, of course, I wanted to ask you is about the water crisis. I mean, so how has that affected Cooperation Jackson? And what has Cooperation Jackson been able to accomplish and in response to the water crisis? And is that, I mean, to a certain extent, the cooperation with Cooperation Vermont, I think, is a product of evolution as a result of global climate change, in a way. I mean, you talk a lot about the cooperation with Cooperation Vermont as being useful or a productive way of thinking about climate refugees and movement of people as a result of climate change. What other changes are taking place, in particular as a result of the water crisis going on now?
Well, let me say just honestly and frankly, this water crisis is really distressing to me. As I noted, the city has been shrinking. In 2014, by all accounts, the city had over 200,000 people in it. Last census, 2020 census, the city had lost 40,000 people. It's only a little bit more than 160,000 people. And there's already been a fair number of businesses in the community which basically have just been forced to shut down because they cannot operate under the terms and conditions that exist. And I want folks to know, they are saying, in particular, the state are saying that the water is fine. It is not in any form or fashion. That was Tate Reeves, basically, since he's now kind of more in control of the situation than the municipality is and the city is, getting rid of a political inconvenience. But, and if you don't believe my word for it, go just look up from about 2 weeks ago. The DOJ, Department of Justice, is, threatened to sue the city of Jackson for having unclean water. Right. Now, I think they worked some things out with the city because they didn't follow through on that motion. but they sure enough reported and threatened, and it really didn't. It was really counterproductive in my view. But the piece that concerns me is that people are going to have to start making some decisions with their feet, to make sure that their kids can get safe drinking water. And I think that's already starting to sink in, and which means my concern is that the city will shrink further, and that will totally weaken the political project, the long-term political project. There's a history which produced the politics that we are allowed and have, constructed for ourselves to play in Jackson. But if that base of community is not there, which is rooted in that history, rooted in those certain relationships, believe me, the progressive politics that exists there that allow us to do this type of experimentation, it takes a long time for something like that to build and mature. So losing it is not an easy piece, right? You can suffer electoral defeat per se, like, I didn't like these policies, I didn't like that. But, losing that type of base and that history can replace that. So I'm very concerned about the history of Jackson from this water crisis and how it's being managed. And the piece why I'm saying this is that there's no plan to resolve it. I'm just, being real with you guys. It's going to take a minimum, $5 to $10 billion to fix the system. Jackson does not have the tax base to cover that. It would take the existing population, if it didn't shrink, about 25 to 30 years to come up with that amount of money in taxes. And by that time, the system will even collapse even further. The state government, given the Tate Reeves leadership, and further beyond that, the Tea Party, that's who really runs the Mississippi. The politics, the libertarian, kind of right-wing libertarian politics, that's what's at the core of what calls itself the Republican Party in Mississippi. They aren't going to give us shit. They aren't going to do anything, which leaves a very contested federal government to kind of draw upon resources. And, as we witness, Biden couldn't get his own Build Back Better bill, even on the floor to be voted on. So there is no immediate respite that's coming for us. Out in recognizing that, what Cooperation Jackson is doing is pushing, for the development of some resilient systems. So we're trying to develop water catchment systems. We've done 2 as a demonstration project, since the water crisis has started.
How do those work?
Just basically big tanks associated either in the open field or connected to houses with, concave roofs that we can, collect, drain water off of, and then hold, store, and filter for it to be used as portable water. That's the piece that we're trying to do. But we're trying to be very clear with everybody. That's not an answer to the problem. Right. It will help a certain number of people in the community have some backup resources and a backup option, but it's not going to be sufficient enough to provide 160,000 people with portable drinking water on a daily basis. It's just not, right? And like, we're not going to lie to nobody and tell you this is just a resilient alternative kind of backup that we're trying to do, because we know like the cavalry is not coming. And we got to do that ourselves. But even that is a problem, because even though our alternative is considerably cheaper than the billions of dollars that is needed to fix the real infrastructure, it's not like what we're doing is cheap for folks in our community either. So we're still going to be trying to raise millions of dollars in a broad kind of coalition effort to help build out these systems over the course of the next 6 months to a year is what we're gearing up for right now. That's moving pretty well, but just being realistic about its limitations. Overall, I mean, on a social level, it was, the community response overall was great. It was insufficient, but it was great. Demonstrated a whole level of layer of solidarity and some other kind of things that you can kind of qualitatively engage and measure. I think that is evidence of some of the work and the politics behind the work, kind of seeking in and having a broad level of support. But some of our co-ops have suffered like the businesses I told you. So, we made a choice, basically, the end of the summer harvest. We destroyed it, right? Because we basically at a certain point said we're not going to be serving, vegetables grown with, sewer water, untreated sewer water, which is basically what you had for a good chunk of September, all of September, and a good chunk of August. So we made a choice to let that go. So that's no income from Freedom Farms for the summer, basically. Or, I shouldn't say no, they had the earlier part went okay. What was cultivated in June and July. But it was, largely greens that they were really focusing in on. Turnip and collard greens are a big business down south. So that's what they were kind of planting and, banking on. And they lost all that. It's gone. So, so in that sense, they're trying to regroup and figure some things out. The only co-op that did relatively okay, I think, or somewhat stable from all that is the green team. The grass still grew and all that, so they can go cut plenty of that. But everything else, it's interesting, like our community production co-op, I don't think any of us ever factored in how much the community production co-op uses water and its production process. Right. But we learned the damn hard way, we never at any line item other than like a utility, right? But, if we don't have it, then there's some precision cutting stuff that couldn't get done. There's some other, like engraving stuff just couldn't get done. There's some other training activity couldn't get done. So it didn't stop them, but it definitely slowed down some production stuff that they were doing. Right. And so, we see ourselves as a reflection in that regard of the health of some of the other businesses. So, and I think, when we look at the quarter balance sheets around stuff, the end of October, we'll have a real assessment of, how the end of the summer went. And I don't think anybody's looking forward to seeing those numbers. I'll put it that way. Right.
Boy, what a just unconscionable situation. All right, I have a million more questions, and I'm gonna open it up to others because I know that others have questions too. I will say, don't answer these, but I do at some point want to ask you about electoral, the project of kind of like electoral gains, which I think was a piece of it, important piece of it in the obviously with the election of Chokwe Lumumba. But anyway, and so the role of elections, and then the other question I really want to ask you is what you think about the concept of utopia and its relationship to Cooperation Jackson. I'll come back in later though, but I want to open it up now to others who have questions and who are really eager to join in. And I'm going to start with Rizwan. Can you turn on the mic there? And one of the things we can do also is if you have a question, if you're on Zoom, if you have Zoom on and you've muted your, you mute your Zoom, but if you turn on your video, then Kali can see you better. Otherwise, there's the room view. Can you see the room view a little bit, Kali?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, okay, great, okay. So Rizwan, do you want to go first? Is it working? All right, let me pass you mine. Hold on.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Rizwan. So what I wanted to ask was, obviously the basis of Cooperation Jackson and any cooperative movements is the community, and I think religion and faith is an incredibly powerful tool to develop the community. And it's obviously been prevalent. There's the role of the Black church. There's New Africa's influence from the political Islam of Malik al-Shabazz. There's the impact of Gandhian nonviolence and Hindu thought. So I wanted to ask about the role of religion and faith in Cooperation Jackson in particular, and what place religion has in utopian thinking moving forward. Thank you.
Maybe take one more.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you very much for all this interesting insights. I have a question regarding the pluralization of knowledge within your organization. Because when you build up such a huge system with all these different and partial elements, as we just have seen, whether you want it or not, there's always like a concentration of knowledge at several points of people or at parts of the organizations. And so are there any specific measurements, and also regarding, you mentioned it, the major drain of people leaving the city, are there any measurements to pluralize the knowledge beyond several people, like rotational systems of people in charge? Or is it really up to people being a lot committed? And what happens if those people go away? What happens if you go away? I would be interested in that, if you can say something.
Let's take one more question, and then Kali will let you respond. Elias.
Hi. Thank you so much for speaking with us. My question is about what you wrote about combating gentrification, along with your discussion about creating cooperative movements within a legal system and political culture that's hostile to cooperative economic structures. I think is also true for efforts to combat gentrification. And I was wondering if you could speak to how you and other members of Cooperation Jackson attempt to fight gentrification, given there's so many legal structures locally with chambers of commerce and nationally or globally with things like federal banks making it easier for speculative bankers to purchase devalued homes.
Yeah.
All right, super. So we've got three sets of issues. One of them is questions of spirituality, perhaps spirituality and religion, and its role of spirituality in political movement making. The second having to do with the way in which knowledge is transmitted and shared, and generational issues also of knowledge transmission and pluralization of knowledge, and then the question of gentrification and how Cooperation Jackson in particular is dealing with that.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Great questions. All of them. Try to go one by one from the top. How best to answer that? I mean, I wouldn't, we don't do anything explicitly per se. spiritual or religious, but it's in everything. By virtue of, who we are. And as you noted, the foundations of the community. And if anything, I think we are a good example of synchronicity, if that's the word I'm looking for. Because we have a fair number of folks who practice Ifa or some variant thereof, of the Santeria, Voodoo, that kind of tradition coming out of, Benin and Nigeria, what's now Benin and Nigeria. We've even had, we're home to, our space has been used off and on for years as kind of a home for a church, kind of an Ifa church, if you would. I myself come from a Muslim background. One of my other co-directors is also Muslim background. The incoming, the person who's more likely to, within the next year or two, going to be replacing me, he's a Christian minister, ordained Christian minister. So it's there, right? It's there, and everybody, nobody is in any way hiding their faith, nor is anyone overly promoting their faith. There's been a steady balance. The only issue where I think a few things have been at times touchy within the community, where faith, different orientations and positions of faith come into practice. It's been about being very clear and explicit around our space and our practices, being embracive of queer folks in particular. That has been kind of a flashpoint for different folks, sometimes along articles of faith. But that hasn't, we haven't really had to deal with that hardcore in a couple of years now. That was a big battle some years ago. And my roster brethren were the most dogmatic on the question. And I don't necessarily think they're those that are kind of working with us most consistently. I don't think per se their views per se have changed, but their practice has changed significantly. So that's, it's a process. It's an ongoing process. But you people come, and if somebody offers a prayer in any form or fashion, it's never been stopped. People accept it, embrace it, and we've had that, duas and all of the kind of thing from everybody, in different ways. So it's just a part, I think, of how this particular Black community is constituted and our understanding of it and relating to it. And I think if there is a political principle, is that we are open to everybody, right? And that was something that we fought for some decades ago in this community, particularly around folks embracing the growth of the more African spiritual-based contemplate, Santeria, Ifa, Voodoo. There were some hardcore struggles, particularly from some of the Christians in the early 2000s about, that's devil worship or that's this. And myself and other folks fought for that inclusion. I think we won some of those battles. And so if we're on guard against that type of prejudice, against somebody's faith and ideas. The piece around concentrations of knowledge and concentrations of power, because those two things go together. That is a deep question. That is a serious one. We started off in certain areas with profound degrees of uneven development, right? So I've done co-ops before. Wasn't new to me in Jackson. I'd done stuff like that before, had other kind of similar related experience. So that I start off with a benefit in terms of some knowledge that you can bring to bear and bring to the group. But it also is that knowledge is also a form of concentrated power that you then have to set up practices and forms of struggle and accountability to make sure it's constantly transferred. And so the best way for us is we are a political project first and foremost. So political education is kind of at the heart of almost everything we do, and the political process, the political decisions and deliberations that we make are often very different than most of what you would encounter in most other kind of co-op spaces, right? So we always kind of say, I should have said this earlier, brain fog, so excuse me. But, most co-ops, if you go to like how most people train co-ops, it's like people who share an interest, or people like a community of folks who share a need. We don't have a grocery store. We need a grocery store or something like that. Like people come together and try to fix their need. We started off with a very different, what are the pieces around how we think it would be best situated for Black working class people to attain power, and particularly power over the productive process. We did an assessment and evaluation based upon that, and then try to develop co-ops to suit those needs. So we often started with people who have no knowledge. Most of the people, with the exception of maybe 2 or 3, we was like, food sovereignty is a must. We cannot allow food to be used as a weapon against us. And we've seen that in our history, recent history, like with Hurricane Katrina. We didn't have any damn farmers in our group, but it was like, okay, this is a necessity. So some people are going to now have to learn how to do this. And that there's, stumbling blocks and things you got to learn along the way. But that's a different orientation than say, let's just put a bunch of farmers together who might have an interest in doing some urban farming, right? They have a different orientation, a different learning curve, different set of things that they have to learn. So that political education and engaging in that constantly is our way of doing that and trying to transfer that. But, there's some issues with that. One of the things that I know I've been grappling with and been, somewhat very public about the last couple of years is about how, and this gets to your question in part, Bernard, how democratic can a vision be, right? And what brought me to that conclusion is that there's like the founding generation and people who were there for all these deliberations and discussions, and there's what's written, and then there's the assumptions underneath what is written, right? That only those people within those conversations to a certain part might be privy to. What you're asking people when you bring them on into this vision to also be accountable to those assumptions, right? To uphold certain assumptions and positions that they weren't around to make or deliberate on. So it's like you're asking me to be accountable for something I wasn't there to deliberate upon, right? So even you engaging me in a particular way of like, well, this is how we do things, right? There's automatically kind of an in-group and out group. Now you can become a part of in-group, but how do you become a part of in-group, right? What level of group think? So the process and the political education piece is our way of overcoming it, but it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. And so that piece around like what happens when people leave, we faced that. And in 2 occasions, it hurt some of the program work significantly. Because there's what you can state and share, or there's what you read in the book, but any author of any book will tell you, what I was able to put on paper is like 1/10 of what I actually possess in knowledge in my head, right? And so that there's that human gap. And so it's one that we are very conscious and deliberate about constantly trying to engage, but there's no foolproof plan. The proof is going to show up 25 years from now, when I'm off the scene, where are things standing? And I've gotten to a point, I'm going to fight for certain views, try to make sure that certain politics and principles are upheld, but I'm also very clear that 10 years from now, this project, as I'm transitioning to a new role, right, stepping away from being the ED, 5-6 years from now, it may be profoundly different. But if that is the outcome through the democratic choices that people make who are there carrying out the work, then I'll be fine with that. I've grown to that point. Okay, that I'll be fine with that, as long as the principles of how those things came about were kind of upheld. The last piece around gentrification. We thought we fought that by developing the CLT, right? But capital is a resilient and tricky beast. It really is. And let me give you an example of what I mean by that, why I say that. So our largest holding is the Ida B. Wells Plaza, where we're working on building a grocery store to be kind of a big flagship in the community. And we got that in 2019. It's been very severely disrupted by COVID. Still coming along, but way far behind from where we were hoping it to be at this point. But in the prelude to it, we did a bunch of beautification work, particularly to the exterior. A lot of mural projects and arts and stuff, and big arts festival, at least big for us. To beautify the building, change the culture, change the scenery. And the building, the whole space had been abandoned for like 5 years. Well, not all of it, but the portion of it had been abandoned for like 5 years. So we did that. So we got these nice big pretty murals that are up, and then there's a new space that's down the street, the very same street, Monument Street, that became open. And we really didn't have any interest in buying it, but we're just doing our homework around conditions and where things are moving. So we have a whole process of how, and one of the, like an anecdotal thing, but I think it's worth noting, we do a racist check, a market racist check for all property. So we were first, wherever the real estate holder is, we find one of our members or supporters, white members or supporters, with the most Southern drawl accent that they can possibly have or can put on. We have them call first, right? And get the whole listing and what the price is, blah, blah, blah. Then we have somebody Black call, right? To see what the pricing and the listing. And it's always different, and it's always different by a percentage of 10. I bullshit you not, right? So we just noticed as a factor. So we called during this process. And mind you, when we're doing this, we're largely all sitting in the same room. Like you guys are sitting in that room, right? And we just have one person talking to everybody. Just shut up. Don't say nothing, but listen, right? So there's witnesses. So we had somebody call about this property. The first call, they called and they were talking about the value of the neighborhood going up. There was all these interesting new projects and all these different things, and then they just started describing the mural and the beautification work. right? It's something that was driving the value of the property up. They were describing us, the people that they were on the phone with. And we all just turned around and looked at each other, and, excuse my French, were like, oh shit. What we have done is now a draw to the gentrifiers, right? It is now like we have created a trigger signal, like there's some new activity, there's some new life, this may be now worth investing in. And that, the way that she described it, that property is not worth $50,000. She was selling it for $150,000. Right? And so that's just one of the things like, okay, maybe we don't do any more mural projects to keep the price down, right? Like maybe we go and, put trash back in front of all the buildings, or, to just keep the prices deflated and devalued. Because that was a piece of like, even though we own this, it's a nonprofit that owns it, it's for nonprofit purposes in the long term, it was being used by capital speculators to increase their own profitability for something that they put absolutely not one penny, not one iota of effort, time, energy, labor into it, but it found a way to profit off of it. So the long and short of the answer is, brother, I wish I knew the real answer to that question, but I don't.
That sounds like a natural DOJ experiment right there.
Right.
Boy. Okay, we got another round of 3 questions. I've got Kendall Long, Daniel in back, and then Hope. Okay, so here we go.
Need to get off pretty soon, Bernard. My throat is starting to give out on me.
Hi, my name is Kendall. I'm from Texas. I really appreciate this Southern perspective, and that's kind of what my question is about. It's a 2-part question. So the first is about what folks from and in Jackson think of the cooperative network and scaling the co-op movement, especially in cities larger, farther, less Black than Jackson. And the second part, you mentioned earlier how a lot of people from Jackson move out, between the 20s and 50s. And so I myself, as someone who's from Texas, and I left after high school, and I hope to be back after I start practicing after I graduate law school. But it's a very different place, and I imagine them to be similar throughout the South of in 9 to 10 years time, a lot of the larger cities in the South have changed a lot because of gentrification, because of people leaving, because of the political landscape changing and stuff like that. So I'm curious your thoughts on people from the South, but that are, I guess now maybe we consider transplants, moving back there, a part of very right movement. Because I do think in many ways Southern communities lead the nation in political activism and imaginative thinking in the times of crisis and things like that. But also there's this tension where it's outside of the South, there is a very significant disdain towards the South, the deep South, the Bible Belt South, because of many things, whether it be the political representatives, because of economic opportunities, and things like that. So I'm just curious your thoughts on on I guess the first hand of the issue, there is a significant number of people that do leave or flee the South for various reasons, but upon returning or being welcomed back to the South, how that can or should happen in ways that don't leach or disrupt movements that are are happening in the South.
So we'll take 2 more quick questions.
I'll stand up. Hey, I'm Dan. I have a question that oddly is a counterpart to that question. So you mentioned the history of the New African movement and how Cooperation Jackson emerges out of the New African movement, which if I understand it correctly was sort of vehemently internationalist and connected to sort of third world socialisms that emerged in the same time. And if I understand it correctly, sort of Chokwe Lumumba's vision emerged sort of in conversation with Nyerire's project, with Nkrumah's project, as well, with Patrice Lumumba's vision. And I'm sort of wondering, in a world where third world socialism has been like brutally murdered, right, at the heart of empire. What is your internationalist outlook? Like what vision do you see for Black sovereignty in the Deep South in conjunction with, is this sort of vision still alive? Is there connection still alive? Do you imagine some sort of sovereignty connect, or some sort of economic connections between Cuba, left projects in South America? What does that look like?
Hi, thank you. I'm Hope. I'm an undergrad, so thank you for letting me infiltrate your seminar here. So given that we're living in a world characterized by ongoing mass disabling events and advents like COVID, police brutality, environmental degradation, I'm incredibly curious about the relationship between disability and the cooperative. And I don't mean to sound passive aggressive or precocious when asking this question. I'm still working on my people skills, but I was wondering how the cooperative can challenge predominant notions of ability and personhood despite emphasis on productivity and work.
Great. Kali, go ahead.
Great questions. So starting from the top, I would say it really would depend on who you talk to in the community and what their class background and orientation is. Where you'll either, find certain levels of disdain, and from, I think particularly using the old school language, like there's a set of Black petty bourgeois forces who see us as competition, who see us as muscling in on kind of their territory and space, who have no great love for us. And then there's Black working class people who will do anything they can to support and see things advance. So, it's kind of an interest-based orientation in many respects in that regard. I think it's much easier for someone who was, say, born in Jackson, moved away even for a while, to come back and start working again in the community. I don't find that being a barrier at all to folks who left, going to college, going to the military, lived away for a while and then come back. Like, that's highly kind of embraced, actually, in my kind of experience in Jackson. They're it's like, what is your proximity to the South, I think, is kind of the barrier in some regards. And so somebody like me, I was born in Los Angeles, but to folks who are from Mississippi and Louisiana, and still have a lot of family connections in those places, like in Mississippi. So there's a level of, say, some folks who come from New York and Chicago. Well, not the Chicago people, because they're Mississippi people, but most of some of the folks from the East Coast, like, they've had more Caribbean backgrounds or backgrounds from, like, the Carolinas. So they don't have, like, the deeper family connections in Mississippi that folks can call upon. And then folks have a measure of who are you connected to, who are your people, right? Like, that is, as you know, but for everybody, who you belong to and who you're accountable to is very important. How people judge you and your character, right? And whether they will work with you or how serious they're going to take you, how far they will trust you, etc. Like, that's very critical. So, I knowing that as a, the way my mom was, in particular, she growing up in LA in the 70s and 80s, at the height of the gang stuff, the turf wars, we used to call them. She tried to send her boys. She had 3 boys. I'm the middle one. She kept trying to send us down south, back home. But she was, I'm going to send y'all back home, like over the summer, so y'all stay out the street, i.e. don't get involved with the gangs and be safe. She didn't quite understand that, the gangs were already there in Mississippi. So it wasn't much of a respite in the way that she thought, but it was safer than LA. But you learn a lot of things, and I just was there, always able to come in and like count on my folks and other people in the community as like, a way to be a bridge, for me. And I always try to impart that to folks who are coming down, like if you're going to go down south and you're from like the north, it's probably better for you to go someplace where you already have existing relationships with, unless you're coming for very specific political reasons, with political folks who are going to anchor you and incorporate you into a community. So that's a piece I would say, to anybody, is just kind of a lesson if you're thinking about that from whatever your positionality may be. Remind me of the second question. The brain fog is hitting me.
So the second question is fascinating, and it really builds on the longer history or the international history.
The international, yeah,
of,
right. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Go
yeah,
ahead.
we're about as international as can be, I would argue. And we've been very clear and explicit about building connections as far and wide as we possibly can. We a lot of folks in our work, in our organization over the years, took a lot of inspiration from the Zapatistas. A considerable number of our folks have spent time there, going back to 1994. I was there not too long, in the summer of 1994, so about 6 months after, the initial uprising. So that's been a big source, and of course the wave of kind of left momentum in South America in particular. From Brazil, a lot of some of the initial reinterrogation of co-ops, at least in the circles that I was in, came from how that was, how cooperatives, participatory budgeting, people's assemblies were being used by various formations in Brazil, from, the landless people's movement, to the Workers' Party, parties to the left of it, that we had been in contact with, coming from, a left political formation ourselves that we already had relationships with, and we're watching them grow, develop, making advances, but, always kind of learning and engaging. That practice hasn't stopped. The piece that we found the most interesting, I would say, as kind of like some direct parallels, in a way many others have not, is what's happening in Roosevelt, with all of his contradictions, and there are plenty, but they're kind of combination of, ecological orientation, cooperatives, quote unquote feminization of politics, very much echoes a lot of the things that we kind of came at on our own, and then kind of found each other, through the course of history of like, oh, that sounds familiar, or that looks interesting, or, check this out, sharing some information. There's profound differences as well, but that's been interesting. And we've been engaging folks from the region since we started, basically. And just recently, like even re-engaged and involved in an extended study group with folks. And we're setting up an exchange piece with some folks in the Catalan region, left Catalan-based independence-oriented folks, deep off in the cooperative work, for many moons there. So, there's some work that we've been doing here recently with some folks doing some cooperative work in Zimbabwe, the shack dwellers movement in Azania, i.e. South Africa. So I can go on. That's still us. That tradition never changed. The location of the centrality relating around states, that part has definitely shifted. As those left formation movements, as you notice, were just either crushed or sold out, for lack of a better term. That's still there. And it's, still very much a part of the theoretical grounding and orientation. Like I would say it hasn't shifted, it's just the location of the practice has shifted from the beginning. And then how do we make this real given the times and conditions and the limitations of, in our case, dealing with the U.S. government on all levels. In their case, folks having to deal with these neoliberal regimes everywhere, right? So just trying to figure out how do we work around them, work through them when necessary, et cetera. This piece around ability and value. This is a deep political question that we've been dealing with. And this notion of productivity is one that we've been grappling with. And we have fundamentally kind of more leaned towards trying to be as productive as possible in producing value by our own measure and score, and trying to re-articulate that, and then find different ways to both appropriate it and to utilize it, which is a little bit different than saying redistribute it. And that would take a long thing to get into. But we've been very much in that, but also, trying to take into account the various ways in which, the social relationships that we are embedded within limit our human capacity and the different types of struggles that we have. I'm not, we are in some struggle around whether we call certain things disabilities or not. But one of the main things that's impacted our community, like very close and very intimately, is mental health, right? Several members in leadership struggled with bipolar, schizophrenia, substance abuse, known substance abuse. So, like, how do you incorporate that and deal with all the different fluctuations of, kind of like people's performance? That's something we've been trying to bake in. But it's this whole piece why I said we lean definitely towards the productive end, is understanding that the nature of the repressive and racist confinement pieces that we are in. So it's like, look, if our aim is to have food sovereignty and to prevent certain things from being used as a weapon, we have to kind of figure out how do we reallocate our labor in broad ways. So it's not just relying upon the folks who are the quote unquote farmers, but other volunteers, people coming in, lending and supporting ours to make productive capacity go a certain way. And we're trying to do that very deliberately. It's like, you're not having 5 people try to feed 500. They may be kind of like anchors, but not responsible for doing all that work, because it's going to produce the burnout, right? It's just guaranteed that's going to produce the burnout. So how do you distribute that, but distribute the responsibility and the focus of your focus to get us to that, not that you are supposed to produce enough caloric intake for us all to survive, but facilitate how we collectively do the work so that we all get there. That's a piece that we're trying to aim towards doing, because it's somewhat, it wouldn't be, I'm not exaggerating to say that there's certain dimensions of the types of racism that we have confronted very obviously, very openly, that's been exposed to the world if anybody cares to look, with the water crisis, right? And so, like, there's a way, like, if we don't take certain things, as I was mentioning, if we don't take certain things into our own hands, they will literally, starve us to death. That is how vicious and mean folks like Tate Reeves and the folks in the Republican Party are. So it puts you in a dynamic, whether you want to be or not, of having to compete with them, having to exert amount of very clear, obvious resistance to them. And that puts you into a certain dynamic of productivism. And there's no way around that we've encountered right now, which then doesn't put the onus of work on other communities. And so what I mean by that, we've had some very extensive arguments around, like, look, if we don't do this and we're relying on market forces to do it, what that then means is that for our needs to get serviced, often the capital forces around us will then exploit migrant labor to do it, right? And they don't have the same level of agency that we do to speak up, to organize, and to fight back, right? So how do we think of this in a whole kind of systemic way of building our own, productive capacity to be able to resist and to have as much kind of agency as we possibly can. Haven't figured it all out by any stretch of the imagination, but just are very aware of these dynamics and their limitations.
Right. Thanks, Kali, and thanks so much, Kendall and Hope, for those great questions. And Daniel, your question, raised something that I felt that this session of Utopia really has the deepest connection to Revolution 1313, which was last year's seminar series. And, I saw it when I was reading, Kali, your chapter on People's Assembly overview, right, in the book, Jackson Rising, which is such an excellent, amazing book that you edited and wrote, the portions that you wrote. And your chapter starts with Amilcar Cabral, right? It starts with a quote, we must practice revolutionary democracy in every aspect of our party life, right? And you can feel it woven through this project. And of course, it is woven through the project because of that historical trajectory, which goes back to the 1970s and the liberation struggles in the US and abroad. And I can really hear in this trajectory, kind of like and in Cooperation Jackson, a modern iteration, a more modern version of, notions of Ujamaa from, Julius Nyerere and those notions of revolutionary practice, which are right here on the page, so the connections are really there. And that's one of the things I find most interesting about the theory and practice of Cooperation Jackson today, are those roots and the continuities and the overlaps with so much of the thinking from the 1960s and 70s. So thanks for raising that, Daniel. Kali, it's been just amazing to have you with us, and I thank you so much for doing it, even though you aren't feeling 100%, and I know that you're worn out. But I did want to give you the closing words, and the closing words on a very simple question, which is, so how do you relate to the concept of utopia? Or concrete utopias. That's the particular concept I'm trying to mine this year, is concrete utopias, but concrete or not, or maybe just utopia. I thought maybe we could end there.
Yeah, no, I'm a profound believer in it. If I wasn't, I wouldn't be talking to you. I wouldn't be bumping my head up against the wall in Jackson. Trying to create some fissures of light to come through to take us out of Plato's cave. No, there's actually another world over there. Not just little reflection that's just here, but no, yeah. Like I said, I think that the left doesn't dream enough. Like that used to be our strength, right? To be able to like, hey, no, we can create another thing. Here's a vision of it. Our utopias, and I think we need to get back to that, but just make it practical. That's the piece of what we're striving for. But I will caution you. In the sense, not against that, but I'm also very, folks who know me well will also tell you sometimes being around me, it's like, worse than the mainstream news. Because I'm always just kind of recounting it like, damn, it's bad here, it's getting worse, it's blah, blah, blah. And that's and folks are like, well, if you're extremely pessimistic. And I'm extremely pessimistic. That is who I am. That is a core part of what I'm going through. But I always bring it back to this, and I'll close. The older I get, the more I think, to a certain level, not that she provided profound like theory, but at a emotive core and a core lesson. And that's my grandmother, Vivian Kavanaugh, who just always reminded me that if you think you have it bad now, imagine being on a slave ship.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And she would always get your head on straight. You ain't got it that bad. So, you got room to maneuver. You got room to do something. Make the most of what you got at the end of the day, right? Like that's what you can do. So you can kind of sulk and pout about it, or you find some way to do something within the limitations that exist.
Right.
And you're not trying to stay within the limitations. So it's always a question. Like one of the things I always tell people that I train is like, as a good organizer, you got to figure out, what rules can't bend, what rules can bend, what rules can break.
Right.
That is your task. Figure that out, and then you figure out how to move.
All right. Well, those are real words of wisdom. And they make me think also of last year's Revolution 1313 on Gramsci, right? Which is pessimism of the mind, but optimism of the will, right?
Of the will, right? Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will.
Yep. All right. Well, listen, first of all, I really want to thank you so much, Kali, for joining us, for doing everything, even though we couldn't have you here in person. I owe you this trip to New York City, and so we're going to do it some other time. We'll be having a seminar for the rest of the semester, and in the spring semester, other people will be talking, but I've got an open invitation for you to get on that plane and come to New York when you're feeling better. Thanks so much for doing this, even though you weren't feeling. So first of all, thank you so much. You were inspiring and brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then I want to end by inviting everyone to our next seminar, which will be on October 26th, so it's in 2 weeks. And we'll be turning to unionization efforts and conceptions of work and new conceptions of work. We have Alyssa Battistoni, professor of political theory here at Columbia, who'll be joining us and who's written a lot about unionization efforts and labor efforts and has two two brilliant essays on that. We will also have Helen Zhao, who is a colleague of ours here in the philosophy department, and Dominic Walker, also another graduate student here, and to talk about the Columbia University graduate student unionizing efforts and realities. I've also invited Chris Smalls from the Amazon unionization efforts. So I've got an invite out. If anybody knows Chris Smalls, please reinforce the invitation. But I'm going to try and bring people from Amazon, maybe Starbucks, unionization also, so we can have a big conversation about those efforts as a form of creating a just world. All right, so thank you so much, and thank you again, Kali, and thank you all for being here. It was really spectacular for me. This conversation was great. Thanks.